So I want to welcome everybody to the first event of our 2024-2025 Team UDAS lecture series. This is the first of 6 exciting talks that we have scheduled throughout the fall and winter semesters, featuring work by award-winning architects, authors, and thinkers from all around the world. You'll notice that posters have started to pop up around the building. So please take note of those and please mark in your calendars, if you haven't already, the evenings that we have these events happening in the pit. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dustin Valen. I'm a professor here at the Department of Architectural Science at TMU, and I am co-chair with Jennifer Esposito, give us a wave, Jennifer, of this year's lecture series committee. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors in particular. Without these sponsors, there would be no lecture series. And so we are extremely grateful to have the support of the Ontario Association of Architects, ERA Architects, Thames Valley Brick and Tile, Merrant Construction, Sense Engineering, BDP Quadrangle, and Shop 3D. Extremely thankful to all of these sponsors. I want to thank also our fantastic administrative team, Alexandra Berciano, who is responsible for the posters that you'll see outside, Francisco Bianchi, who does all of the kind of backstage financial stuff, but most importantly is also the purveyor of your pizza, which has arrived shortly before. And I want to thank Alin Sorino as well for fielding all of our ridiculous questions. This is the first time Jennifer and I have taken over this task, and so it's been a steep learning curve for us, which has caused us to harass the administrative team more than we probably should. I also want to thank our student volunteers for being a part of this year's lecture series committee, and to remind all of you that these are opportunities that often come up in the school. So if you're interested in participating in the work of the lecture series committee, please keep us in mind when those calls for volunteers go out. The students are the glue that binds our disorganized effort. Without them, we would be as unstuck as we are unhinged. So with that, I want to turn things over now to one of our students on the committee, Dhruvan Modugula, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker and make a land acknowledgement on behalf of the school and our university community. So welcome, Dhruvan.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you guys to the first Dash Lecture Series event. My name is Dhruvan, as Dustin has stated, and before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the we have gathered on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And this land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Omar Gandhi, a visionary founder of Omar Gandhi Architects, established in 2010 with studios in both Halifax and Toronto. Renowned for his critically acclaimed work, Omar has gained international recognition for his diverse portfolio, which includes innovative urban infills, large-scale public projects, thoughtful intervention with historic landscapes. His studio is celebrated for the playful yet profound approach to design, reinterpreting the familiar but bold site-responsive architecture. Each project reflects meticulous craftsmanship and deep engagement with its physical and historical context. The firm's impressive accolades, including the Canadian Council for Arts Professional Prix de Rome and Canadian Governor General's Medal in Architecture, testify for their impact in the field. Beyond his practice, Omar has also helped shape the future of architects as the Louis Kahn visiting assistant professor at the Yale School of Architecture. So without further ado, please join me in inviting Omar to the stand.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. It is really wonderful to be here. I was actually here a few months ago for an event for SOSA in the same room, and it was probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever been to. And so I can already tell that tonight is going to be special as well. So I really just can't thank you enough for coming out and for hearing my story. I used to end with a list of people on my team because it was my way of saying that, you know, this is something that we did together. And that's actually the thing that I'm most proud of. So in this situation, I wanted to start with my team right now, both in Halifax, Toronto, and in Victoria, actually. It's the one thing I can probably say that I can take full credit for is putting this team together. And I will come back to that in a second. I just wanted to give you a bit of background about me. So my family came to Canada in the 1950s. This is my great uncle, who was the first to leave India and ended up setting up a home in Brockville after living in Montreal for a while. A few years later, my grandfather joined and ended up living in Montreal for a good part of 40 years. This was about 5 years after that. This is a photo of my mom, my grandmother, and my uncle who came after they essentially came to join him because, as was the case back then, the man left to make enough money to bring the rest of the family abroad. And so their home ended up becoming sort of the stopping point for all of the families that ended up coming over the next several decades. And growing up, I remember one of my favorite memories thinking about um, was Terminal 2 at Pearson, where it seemed like in the 80s and early 90s, it was like every month or two we were there and our face was like pressed up against the glass because someone who you knew was family, although you've never met them and you barely had heard of them, were coming. And it was like a huge emotional thing each time that happened because it had been years before since people had saw their family members. This is my mom and my grandfather in Montreal during her wedding. And that would have been in the late 70s. In the early 80s, the entirety of my father's family was now here. And so his uncles and cousins were all there. And this was actually a special photo because it was actually when my great grandmother, my grandfather's mother on my dad's side, came to visit for the first time. And that's actually me in her hands. Around 2004, it was my first time visiting India, and I got to go with my family. And so this was actually an image of my dad sitting in front of the house that he was born in. So I grew up in Brampton, and it was a beautiful place to grow up. It was like I really look back at those years, kind of in the north part of Brampton, being a really special part of my life. But probably one of the first real sort of curveballs that happened, a real kind of spark of luck back then, was the high school I went to, which was Mayfield. It's a regional arts school, one of I think three regional arts school in the GTA. And it was a total stroke of luck that I got to go there because I wasn't living in the area. It was like 45 minutes away on the bus, deep in kind of rural Caledon. And the actual sort of process of getting in the school was probably the first like ultra terrifying thing I had to go through. You know, we were sitting in a room and there was like a cantaloupe or something, and like 20 people had to draw it with charcoal, and everyone's like bringing out their fancy pencils, and we're like, how old? 12 or something, right? And so, I ended up getting in and got to go to that school and essentially studied art for every day throughout the 5 years that I was there. Now, the years that followed that were pretty exciting. Like I kind of had a pretty good sense that I wanted to go into architecture, partially because of my arts background now at this school and introduction to architectural history. Um, and although, as you guys remember, you applied to a couple schools, but for me, there was really only one. It was like there was one I was going to. I felt fairly good about it because I went to art school, so I probably had a decent portfolio. And so my dad took me to Waterloo, and he waited in the car while I went for my interview, and I got obliterated. Like it was absolutely I came back and he looked at me and he was like, "How did it go?" And I don't think I cried, but I was definitely like, "Let's just get home," right? Like let's wrap this up. I didn't need to wait for the results on that one. So, anyways, I applied to other schools and was very fortunate that I was able to get into the University of Toronto's new program, which was it was the first year of the BA Architectural Studies program. And that was really exciting. Like it was exciting to be out of Brampton, downtown, at a big school. And um, the class seemed like, I'm probably exaggerating this a little bit, but it felt like 200 people in the first year class. Like it was massive, right? And so at that point, it started to really be like, um, how do I fit in here, right? Like, do I even belong? Like, it wasn't really an architecture stream. It was about kind of a broad liberal arts education that would eventually, at some point, lead to a master's program, which you needed, right? And it was tough. Yeah, like it was a tough road. So like for a few years there, it felt like a pretty steep uphill climb to kind of find a place. And I remember I did really well in one class, just one, like enough to get like some one professor's attention. And um, I ended up just sort of at that moment thinking like, I'm in the first year of this. This is like Omar's first time being strategic in any way. I knew that if I waited, I was in the third year, and if I waited one more year, there was going to be like 200 people applying to go to the U of T School of Architecture master program. And so I hedged my bets and I started looking into places that I could get into with 3 years. It could have been in the north. It could have been like some place out in, Saskatoon. It didn't matter where it was, but it just so happened that there was a school out east that really kind of not just changed like the trajectory of like my education, but really sort of turned kind of the whole direction of my life for the best. And so it was Dow. And I was talking out there earlier where there was a bit of a discussion about kind of parallels between this school and Dow. I always thought that this was kind of like a union because when we got into the master's program, all of a sudden there were students from this school who had joined that school. And so it felt very much like there was a real connection between the way that we learned. It also happened to be like two schools that were really good at getting jobs outside of university. So it was kind of proof that it really prepared us well. It was a place where we really learned how to make things with our hands. I was just a leech, like learning from, I had an arts background, but I was really there learning from people who had enormous experience building things for a living with their hands. And so I was just absorbing it all. And I was drawing and I, started to become fascinated with like the idea of these creatures. And like, this is an image of a steel wire model that then was clad in plexiglass. And what did it mean? I don't know, but it was, not too dissimilar to some of the stuff I saw on the tour upstairs. It was just exploratory. And finally, this project that really took kind of a team of people to put together this thing that could be disassembled and then assembled in the middle of the night because we weren't allowed to do it on the Citadel, which is kind of this central landscape feature in the middle of Halifax that you're not actually able to build on. And we dropped this thing in the middle. And the whole idea was that we would watch people interact with this over the course of the next 24 hours. And this thing was set up so that you would watch the moon at a very particular time in the middle of the night on that day. And so this was more than just, I think, being a part of this project for me in terms of the building and the design, but it actually became kind of the first time I started taking photography seriously. And so I documented this project from all angles at different times of the day. And it ended up being kind of the first time that we got something published. That really matters, right? Like that was a real boost of confidence to get something in Canadian Architect. Like, I'm still in school here. So I left school and moved back to Toronto. And first I worked for Young and Wright, which then became IBI. Then I worked for KPMB for about a year or so. And my wife and I at the time had decided, she ended up getting a job in Halifax, and we decided to kind of put our Toronto life, put an end to that. And we decided to move out east again where her family was located. And so I ended up working for McKay Lyon Sweet Apple there for about a year or so. And as these things sort of happen, these curveballs in life, I ended up losing my job. And so in 2010, I ended up kind of moving to a place for a job, didn't have a job, didn't really have, anything really kind of set up. But there was certainly panic because, like, what do I do now? And so this is me sitting in my attic. Like, I had enough time to set up the tripod to take a photo of myself in 2010. And I was just dreaming. Like, I remember I didn't have a job, but there was panic. Like, I needed to make some money. I did not want to. So this is like kind of the bit of selfishness, did not want to work for any other firm. So I hadn't got to the point of panic enough yet. But for a couple of weeks, I sat there and I was just designing my own office. Like, I wasn't really even at the point yet of talking about design in terms of architecture. I was like, of all the things I've learned and the places I've worked and the places I've heard of, like, what kind of office do I want to have one day? It's just me in a room. There's no office. There isn't a project in sight. But I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted. So one of the first projects, I took this picture actually just maybe a year ago. Ended up working for a technologist. I was really digging deep in terms of finding things to do during that time. So I worked for a technologist who, I think he named himself like 1, 2, 3, like technologists, like, so that he was like the first in line when you Google anything. And so those kind of people who were looking to hire the first name on the list hired him to do things like this. And so then he would say, Omar, I need you to draw this. So I whipped out AutoCAD in my attic and I started drawing. And you're looking at that house right there and you're thinking, that's not very pretty. But what you don't know is that it's not the house, it's the deck that actually was the project. And I did the best I could. Right. And so, like, imagine kind of subsequent projects at this scale, bathrooms, little kitchen renos, things like that. And then miraculously, after doing a whole bunch of these things, let's say for 6 months or so, a friend of ours decided they want to do this little addition on the back of their home in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. And so this place was essentially the home of the town doctor for like a century. So many town doctors lived in the same house over the period of time. And it's like one of those places where, it's an aging population. Kids still play on the front lawn. Like, it's a paced place. And it was really important to me that this first project of mine was very sensitive to that. And so this project was kind of part revitalization of something historic. It was a 150-year-old home on the water. And then something that I felt was like very much of the language that I was interested in, which didn't have a style in particular, other than it was doing certain things. It was shielding very intense summer sun. It was allowing in perfect, beautiful kind of winter light deep into the house. It essentially had a view out towards the Mersey River, which is behind Liverpool, that gave them kind of a vantage point that really just didn't, it was untapped. And so it was this kind of two-headed thing that I felt was both kind of very complex in its kind of respect for the area, but then also progressive in terms of the things I was interested in. And so probably the most interesting part about this project in terms of, the trajectory of my career was that we interviewed 3 builders on this project. The first 2 were, well seasoned, like respected by everybody. The third came in and essentially kind of like taught us about construction and architecture in the most kind of wise, incredible way. And I was swept. And so the builder of this project ended up becoming Deborah Herman Spartanelli, and she became kind of a mentor of mine for the next 5 years. Like, someone who, when I had my son, she also knit like this beautiful yellow toque for him. And yeah, she's got a pretty important place in my life. So this, again, this is all just keeping in mind, this is just me in the attic and starting to experiment with modeling and starting to test out light and shading in this view and how we could take what would be a very sort of traditional form, this kind of very low slope shed roof, and how it could be kind of twisted and turned to respond to this natural little grove that was on the landscape. And essentially this like building form that's like mother's arms wrapped around this area so that they could watch their grandchildren play. And so in the middle of this project, we were really lucky that there ended up being this like beautiful article in the Globe and Mail about these first two projects and my incredible relationship with Deborah and our engineer, Andrea Doncaster, and the kind of things that we were doing that were, I think, kind of out of the ordinary for the area, not to mention kind of out of the ordinary in terms of the people who were working on it. From that article came this phone call from a couple. They bought this really kind of beautiful, sparse, regular kind of forested piece of land in Hubbards, Nova Scotia, probably about 10 minutes away from this site and maybe about 45 minutes away from Halifax. And they went to art school. It was kind of their dream eventually after their kids grew up that they would kind of go back to what they went to school for. So they had their regular day jobs and now they could kind of go back to making art again. And so the idea was they would build this little place in the woods that would be very quiet. And so Peg, she called me. What I didn't know was that Garth, the husband, called Deborah on the same day. So like they didn't talk about it, but they actually contacted us in different ways. So it ended up being too far away for Deborah to take on. So I took it on. And essentially the idea for this project was, okay, let's take kind of the most ubiquitous traditional form in Nova Scotia, but probably in Canada, the 12-12 gable. And what if we buried it into the side of this hill and we started experimenting, me, I talked to myself, but it was just me, buried it into the hill and did kind of as little as possible. You know, this long strip that looked out to the woods and a big clear story window above that allowed light into this artist studio. And so from this project built another incredible relationship because it ended up being this amazing guy, probably about this tall, came knocking on my door as we were looking for builders of this thing. And he and his crew of, I think, 5 or 6 people, all like, I would say early 20s, were just eager to do something special. And so ended up taking them on. They met the client. You know, everybody was sort of in love with the idea of this happening. And these guys just crafted the heck out of something that had a very small budget, like really small. And it took kind of like a level of inventiveness through the process as well. And the clients, being artists, were just absolutely interested in playing with kind of found objects and salvaging materials to make like light fixtures and using like the most regular kind of plywood, both for wall paneling and features in there. So really kind of off the shelf type stuff. And so that was the practice like that. Those three essentially kind of spawned the rest of it. And so when I said, you know, I kind of had a chance to sit there at that table and dream, when I look at the image of kind of our team now and the way that we created it, I don't brag often, but I'm going to say there's one kind of stat that is worth more to me than any other thing that we've been fortunate enough to have. In 15 years, not one person has left my studio to work for another firm in the same city. And that's because of the way that we sort of designed this thing. You know, like I envisioned a different way of working with one another, a different kind of spirit of collaboration, of leadership, about the things that matter. And I think that's resonated. In 2012, I moved out of the house finally and moved into this small little studio. And the next kind of miracle in my life happened. First, I had my son in 2011 at the end of the year. And then a week later came Jeff Shaw, who joined me at the time, both as a student first, and then joined me again as a graduate. Together, we've essentially kind of created, I think, the armature for the way that we responded to housing and architecture in general. This idea of adaptation, taking these traditional forms and manipulating it through these kind of very kind of severe and clear ways of manipulating form and ways of looking at the world around it, that we then kind of responded to everything that followed. And so for the next kind of decade, we started building houses, not just across Nova Scotia, but really kind of dotting parts of the country as well. One of the first kind of big projects I'd say for us was Sluice Point in kind of southern part of Nova Scotia. It was really kind of drawing on this idea or the history of the Acadian people in that part of the region, and looking and drawing from these haystacks that you still see kind of remnants of, a way of drawing hay in very kind of poor conditioned marshy land. And this was actually a competition that we won for this house. And so ultimately taking, a very kind of simple to begin with hip-shaped form, and then torquing it and moving it and sculpting the roof so that it was actually looking out in different directions. But when you kind of close your eyes a little bit, it almost feels like a bump in the landscape. This was actually a drawing that a student did while working for me. And believe it or not, it's actually just a little bit smaller than the image on the wall. It's an aerial of that project. And so really kind of taking, the most sort of ordinary materials, essentially kind of prefabricated wood trusses, and sculpting it in a way that created a really dynamic form. And the two of us started falling in love with the idea of these creatures in the landscape, something that feels like it's alive, something that grew out of the land itself, but has multiple personalities at different times of the day and different times of the night. And talking to builders and kind of starting to, I would say, for people, especially builders in these parts of the province, were completely unfamiliar with modern architecture. And so we were sort of not forced, but I think we developed a system of talking about things in really sort of simple, familiar ways. Eastern white cedar shingles and hip roofs and lapping, and talking about the eaves. And just like if you didn't know what you were looking at, you were actually building something extremely familiar. This was the second project where it was really almost about resilience. It was taking this incredible scribed rocky landscape just outside of Halifax that has all of these erratics, these boulders that were left by glaciers, and essentially left kind of these massive 25-foot tall outcroppings in the landscape. And so the idea with this project was we would actually create an extension of that landscape itself by taking these really sort of simple forms, and by clustering it and maybe slightly angling and shifting its location, it felt both like it grew from the landscape, but that you were inhabiting the landscape itself. So even in section, you're kind of meandering up through it and around it in the way that you did before the building was there. And you can see here in this living room or dining room shot, we're really kind of buried into this rocky hillside. And now in the north part of Nova Scotia, in Cape Breton, it's kind of hard to believe this is in Canada, but these are sort of just outside of the Cape Breton Highlands in the north part of the province. And essentially a client came to us and said, we want to build this little thing. We have this beautiful piece of land near the coast. And, can you help us? They were kind of intrigued by some of the work we had done. We were developing a bit of a portfolio. And so we started looking at really ordinary things. So this was actually a series of kind of, really temporary homes, but something we found, very familiar and kind of repeated throughout were these really silly kind of like door appendages that were essentially there to stop the wind, a place to kind of stop the door from slamming, and also a place to have a smoke and not get wet, right? And so in kind of one of those days where you sort of risk it all, I mean, it was early enough that you're kind of risking it all. I asked the client, who was from New Jersey, what if we had one of these things on the side of the cabin itself? Like, but, instead of it being like really haphazard and plywood like this, like, what if it was 25 feet tall and made of Corten steel? And I thought, that this might be the end of this project, uh, maybe pushing it a little bit. But the client was just as excited like a kid as I was. And it really sort of, I would say this project kind of became um, a pretty important one in our portfolio of work, but really kind of spoke about vernacular architecture in a very different way. And that project was actually kind of part of a series of little buildings. Um, these little models that we built were on the same property, kind of closer to the water, and actually for different purposes. One was a lookout, one was the cabin itself, and then the low slung one was actually just to store boats and canoes and kayaks and things. And so my son was kind of at the perfect age at that time where he was into Transformers and I was into Olsen Kundig. And so we started to really kind of experiment with the idea of this thing, this creature that's sort of really buried into the woods, like this little creature hiding with all these trapdoors and mechanisms that, unlike Kundig's project, which are very expensive, these were things from like the hardware store, and the mechanisms, uh, fortunately, I haven't been sued yet. So. And not far from there, again, on this sort of theme of resilience, this project, which was really on this extremely thin piece of land that nobody wanted, and we came up with this plan at that point to do something really narrow, but have like a really low slung shed roof, almost like a ball cap kind of brought down low over your eyes. And essentially what the idea was that the wind that was barreling down the highlands behind it, with winds that exceed 200 kilometers an hour, actually just roll right over this thing. So there was kind of this idea of aerodynamics on this. 2014, just like, incremental growth over the period of this time of our studio. And, being, I think, really, really cautious about hiring people and investing a little bit more in the practice. I mean, I think for me, only 4 years in, things were starting to kind of like, you know, gain momentum, but I was still terrified because it all felt really lucky. This was a project in Kingsburg, not far from Halifax, that was essentially half of a gambrel roof that was taken from this old kind of torn apart building that was sitting in the landscape. And we sort of drove by it one day, and Jeff and I looked at each other and we just drew this kind of half section of this thing with part of it pulled out where a little hot tub went, and just loved the idea of something so kind of menacing on the edge. So I started to miss home at this point. Remember, I moved to Halifax for a job and for, all this stuff. And, my family, everybody was here. I'm from Brampton and my parents are all still kind of in the burbs. And so it was time to start thinking about a Toronto studio, mostly because it was an excuse for me to come home more often. Even though I only told them I was home probably one in every 4 times that I came home. And so the first thing to do was find a place to work. It actually wasn't this space in Parkdale. It was actually my dear friend Drew Sinclair let us rent a desk in the studios of SVN on Richmond Street or on Adelaide Street East. And so we were there for a little bit. And then I called up a dear friend of mine from school. She was still in school, after I had kind of started working and all that, but I knew her through some people, and um, I hired Steph. And so, as some of you know, Steph has become kind of the cornerstone in my studio. She, Jeff, Steph, and you'll hear of a couple more after this. The studio really started ramping up when we started to kind of gain not just an identity design wise, but kind of a whole kind of new bolstered set of values that were important to us. Uh, be design, be kind of the profession, be it whatever it was. It wasn't just me anymore. And it was something that was evolving at like a really rapid pace. And so the first project that we had was Lady Marmalade on Broadview. Best brunch in the game, they say. And it is. And so it was in an industrial, a commercial 100-year-old building. It was actually set up to become a series of residential units. And for some reason, the client or the owner just decided to drop it, and the clients bought it. They already had a well-established brunch place on Queen. So this was just sort of around the corner. But what were we going to do with this place that was just like incredibly dark and dense, and it was just like set up to be kind of extremely efficient in terms of residential layout. And so the idea between Steph and I was just like, okay, well, let's start chopping away at the floor. Like, let's try and somehow get light down from the roof into the ground floor of this space. And so it started becoming this amazing game of sculpting, kind of reductive sculpting, where we just started removing things. And of course, in a scenario like that, you need clients that are like open to losing, very important seats, right? Like that's how you make money, is the tables. But they were absolutely into it. Amazing clients. And it ended up just, I think, being a really great example of adaptive reuse for us. Like, how could we take some of the amazing sort of infrastructure that we have in this city and do something interesting with it without removing it completely? So around that time, and maybe actually slightly before, and Instagram wasn't that old at this point, a text from a guy who I didn't know at all, but seemingly everybody around me knew who it was. Matty Matheson. And I was like, I don't know who this is, but because I hadn't lived in Toronto for the years that his kind of thing just started taking off. And all of a sudden, everybody knew who this guy was, and, you know, that sort of thing. He's like, I want to do this restaurant. There wasn't a whole lot of conversation other than he liked our work seemingly. And the people around me, again, were very excited about this. And so I met with him. I think the first time we met on some kind of pho restaurant on Dundas. And then the second time we met for brunch in Parkdale. And, I didn't know what to expect, really. Like, I knew that this guy had like a huge personality. What I didn't know or expect was like how smart this guy was, like insanely well read, and realized like that his TV persona was kind of like dumbing down, his like being, right? Like he was amazing. Like just his passion for design was enormous. And so he was like full on into hanging in our studio. So what is the first thing a client does? In most cases, this would be your worst nightmare. He and his little team of like 3 people rented the space right next to our studio. Like you saw that little, the image of our studio, there's the door, and then he's on the other side. And so this was a very long project for about 6 years or so. Like he's on our couch just wasting time, like asking questions, right? Like asking questions about things that don't matter. And of course, Stephanie and John Gray just love kind of humoring him. And so we all became very, very close during that time. And so on the site of what was previously Mocha, they demolished that. This was Hallmark who owns this property. And this building was done by Diamond Schmidt. And so we looked at the design that they had, and they were really kind of, I think, open to some of the ideas that we had, which, doesn't normally happen in that kind of a relationship. Like two architects, we're doing the inside of this thing, and we're like, can you dumb it down a little bit? Like, can you take this cool stuff that you want to do on the outside, and can you remove it so that the building itself looks as forgettable as possible? all so that we could build this narrative. And so on the inside was just kind of this cavernous thing. And before we really kind of implementing our design, it had columns all through it. Like it was a two-story place. And again, having these amazing clients that were just open to losing seats, I was like, well, what if we remove the columns? And this ended up just becoming a place where you walk by the most kind of forgettable building that any developer would have kind of produced on Queen West. And you go into this door on the side that definitely looks like is the one that the garbage comes out of. And you enter, and while your eyes are kind of like dilated and you're trying to focus on what just happened, you go in and this like golden egg is on the inside with like the Grateful Dead playing and music just blasting and the most beautiful food and drinks happening. And sometimes Maddie is there and everyone's trying to get his attention and he's looks like a slob and like, all that stuff, right? And it's like, it was like the culmination of all of his dreams and an idea that we came up with in the first setting. And for the next 6 years, and I was telling some students about like kind of what architects deal with, I feel like 99% is just swatting away all of the kind of things that get in the way of the end product. And this fortunately wasn't because they were totally on board. But like you imagine all the things in construction and cost and COVID for crying out loud, like you're just swatting things away. So this thing still turns out the way that we all got excited about. And then there were opportunities as we were moving along. Like, what about this bathroom that is, we need it because it's accessible. We need a barrier-free bathroom. What if we actually sacrifice the space above so that when you go inside, above the toilet is a massive chimney that just looks up at the sky? Silly ideas that, you look at the client and you hope that they don't get rid of you. And fortunately, you align yourself with the right people and, it's what makes a project in a way. And so around that time, in the years kind of right before and right after COVID, things started to really kind of take a turn. This was our 10-year anniversary book and moving into a larger studio and really then starting to play with, I think, projects that had larger budgets where we were able to experiment with form and really start to kind of push this idea of craft at a different level. I mean, I think you can throw money at a project and it doesn't necessarily come out in a way that feels, I think, characteristic of a practice. But we tried to use those extra opportunities to kind of play with opportunities that we didn't have before. This being a project that hopefully starts construction was really kind of us it's a rendering, experimenting with mass timber and technologies that would allow us to design something that was quite sinuous. And this was, it's scheduled to be in Collingwood. And then now my house. It sounds like a lie when I say that the intent was to have the studio on the ground floor and then I live above. But nobody around me really thought that I would want people in my house every day. But somehow it ended up becoming kind of a way that we planned for the space. And so what the ground floor ended up becoming was obviously my kind of home studio setup, but then also a place where we were able to, um, with a very clear intention, able to work on community projects and have people sit around a table from the neighborhood in the North End. And so, not often, we were talking earlier about designing your own house. My brain just started going like crazy. Like I just saw that, like, I don't want to say clients are a barrier. That's not a nice thing to say. But like to have none can be kind of a bigger problem in the opposite way. And it fortunately wasn't for me only because I had a property that I could actually like, it was very narrow and the size was quite constrained. And so it was good to have constraints right off the bat, because if it wasn't, I think you can just kind of spiral out. Like, what do you do? We architects kind of rely on constraints and started to really think about materiality and space and, how to get light down into a gallery space and how to kind of push and pull as much craft as possible out of ordinary things. And so on the front of the house is this grill that essentially serves two purposes. One, so that people obviously can't see directly in. But then the other part of that was, and seeing other kind of contemporary developments in the city, the idea of this glass being right on the property line and feeling like you're hanging over people, it was to kind of create this buffer with no sacrifice to natural light that is basically created between these two spaces, both the public realm and the private domain. And so starting to really experiment with materiality, but also I think a really kind of mature palette that was stripped down and really kind of, I think, where people are most sort of confused when they look at it. They're like, it looks like a bunker and there's no windows. And it really is like, it really is exactly, it feels like a cocoon that's like a big hug that I love going home to. But there's so much natural light that comes in this place from above. And taking, the most ordinary materials, like the buff brick was selected because it wasn't the kind of brick that they use for important buildings in Halifax. It was the kind of stuff that's used on like the sort of service buildings that are in the North End. And so I wanted to pick something that we would take, very ordinary samples of and try and do something special with through craft. And finding opportunities that we never would have had working for a client unless the budget was bigger to start playing with things like hardware, and starting to call like the people I love in this world, like Philotimo and Casson and all these people to start experimenting with like shapes and forms. And what if this thing felt like it actually emerged between two panels of plywood? I can do anything. And fortunately, I'm horrible with money. And so, that's at that point really the only barrier was like, how much do you want to invest in something like this? And ultimately, I kind of just went all in on effort and, investment. Now, one of the community projects that we did, that front screen, which was built using Western red cedar, had an enormous amount of offcuts. And so just down the road at the North End Public Library, we were able to build ourselves as kind of a studio project, a bench for everybody to use. And now the third associate, Jordan Rice. And, in terms of a turn that the studio could make, and I kind of reiterate how important this team is, like it took the most drastic turn when Jordan joined us because he's like the capital A architect of our studio, like with an enormous kind of amount of experience in different building typologies and scales and different places in the world. And so we kind of relied on him. We were really new at that point, myself included, on these kind of new things. But at the same time, while we were experimenting, we wanted to our own language and the language of the houses and the kind of sensitivity that we brought to the table to ring through on the larger projects. And so the first one, Modal, which is the municipality of the District of Lunenburg, a civic building, we wanted to feel like something built in the 70s, like something that I grew up with. It actually kind of reminds me of the Loafers Lake Public Library that was just around the corner from my parents' place, probably built in the early 80s in Brampton. It ended up becoming a Rick Hansen certified project. And the entire thing was built out of local wood. And so where there isn't steel or mass timber or concrete, it was like an insanely simple palette of rudimentary prefabricated trusses again, just like Sluice Point. And so this project was done in collaboration with IBI. This one here was actually a project. We didn't end up winning. We got to the finals, but was a proposal in a competition for a public park just on Richmond. This project also in the north end, you can see we're kind of going in all different directions at all times. This was the North End Community Health Center came to us and said, look, we have this, really dilapidated project, this building on the left that has been vacant for like 15 years and horrible kind of condition on the inside, and people hide out in there, and there's a lot of problems. They asked us to renovate it. And so we did it as a community uh, project and essentially renovated it both in kind of its language and the spirit of it to kind of, I think, with the goal of creating a space that was dignified. And so 12, at the time, homeless African Nova Scotian men moved into this after that. I'm going to go just a little bit faster, guys. Um, this is actually a project that we haven't shown anyone yet. In terms of adaptive reuse, but also thinking about multi-generational living, which, I think we're all really drawn to the idea of reuse in our studio because, you're surrounded by ideas of sustainability all the time. But we have, like I was saying with Lady Marmalade, this kind of beautiful infrastructure and beautiful buildings that you could never recreate, like this 100-year-old house on Markham Street, um, that just needed a new life. And it wasn't about kind of amping it up on the outside so that it looked kind of unfamiliar. We brought a level of sensitivity to it. And so this is one of my childhood friends. He was so happy. I was so happy to get this project started because he bought the place just before COVID. And now his mother, who lived in Brampton, who had a stroke 10 years ago and like a second mother to me, was going to move into this house with two grandkids and the family. And so it meant that we needed to rethink the inside of this place, to not just kind of provide a place for her to sleep and live, but like a beautiful place for her to sleep and live with her grandkids. And so on the inside, it was about these soft curves and this beautiful touch that allowed light to kind of dapple down. We retained as much of the historic fabric as we could. On the day of the photos of this project, which only happened maybe about a month ago, I hired my friend Emma Peter, who's probably one of the best architectural photographers in the world, from Vancouver. And it was kind of like photojournalism because this was the first time my friend's mom was actually seeing the place. And so it was really, really beautiful and touching. And so she was able to navigate it. And there's a elevator core you can see on the left there. And the entire second floor is actually set up for her, including a place to sit outside. And on the back deck, although there's this bench stair seating that they all love hanging around, on the right there, where that black cube is another exterior lift. I'll just whip through these, but this is a project in the Okanagan that, obviously there's a lot of forest fire in that area. There was a really kind of strict language that we used in terms of responding to combustible construction. And so created this sort of BC version. We called it the Steel Beetle, but it was essentially kind of taking our language of these creatures and putting it on the top of a hill in Naramata in the Okanagan. So framed primarily with wood and clad in non-combustible materials, and with this light well down the middle that really kind of allowed as much natural light as possible to kind of filter through. Getting closer to the end, guys. So this was probably, I would say maybe the most important project of my career. I was contacted by mentors of mine at KPMB, place where I work both as a student and as a graduate, And we were always sort of on a lookout for a project that we could do together. And so this is the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia competition that was held, an international competition just prior to COVID, which made kind of working on this, particularly difficult. But, we found ways to do it. And so I think when we started this, right from the outset, there was an understanding that everyone agreed about that this would be a different way of working on Mi'kmaq land, the indigenous peoples of Nova Scotia, where they came to the table first, and we had them around in our studio and essentially listened. Like there's a period of listening where we're just kind of absorbing indigenous knowledge over the period of that first little, you know, time period before we put a pencil to paper. And so that was everybody sitting in the studio. And it was really beautiful because it was a time to dream. And there was, I think, this kind of idea that, okay, we've been through this process before where we're like at it at the beginning. And then in the end, people like ignore all of it and just sort of do what they want to do, like checking boxes. But we were committed in this scenario to really doing something special. And so in the first thing, the partie, taking this very colonial grid on the Halifax waterfront and doing this diagram that was really about kind of shaking that on its head. Like what if we kind of rethink about navigating this property on this space on the waterfront in a very different meandering way. And so taking the eel as the starting point, a sacred species in the area, and almost kind of using that both kind of as an idea of building, but also as an idea of landscape and a way of engaging the water. And this was a beautiful sketch by Mark Ryan of Public Work. And, I talked several times about my team, right? Like you can tell that's the thing I'm most proud of. This was on the eve of the competition submission. We're up against Diller Scofidio. We're up against, some pretty big international firms. And this was everybody in our office working on the final model. And so when I say everybody, I don't mean like all the architects and interns, the admin team, the finance team. We called in friends from PEI to help make the base and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And we had pieces come in from Newfoundland. It was like Atlantic Canada coming together to build this unbelievable model that sat, and no one else brought like kind of a real model in the submission. And so there was this thing that was just like this hulking, intricate, detailed, like every ounce of sweat we could pour into something was in on this. And so we ended up winning the competition. And yeah, really, it was kind of life-changing because it was an absolutely different way of thinking about architecture in a place. Well, Canada's kind of that place, but out east, it felt like a place that really kind of resisted thinking about things in a different way and listening to different people seriously. And so there was a real sort of camaraderie and like feeling of achieving something together. And that the entry here comes from the kind of emblem of the Mi'kmaq hat that they wear that kind of looks up at the sky and peeks down. And in between this envelope is where you slide in as a place or a marking of kind of welcome for people who don't typically feel welcome. This is White Rock in the valley. I feel sweat like literally pouring down my back. Like it's White Rock, another experiment with some friends of mine, another kind of opportunity to really kind of reflect and play in terms of all the things that we wanted to. So now it kind of feels like, oh, we have all these opportunities that we didn't have before. It's about just like the love of design. And so in this project, we designed the furniture. We worked with like amazing craftspeople who do, chairs and leather work and metalwork and lighting, Concord here in Toronto. It was just like an amazing time to kind of play with all of those things. I'll whip through this one. So this is the Riverbend Library, also led by an Indigenous team in Edmonton, where we partnered with Sturgis. And so this was like, I would say, really taking and pushing kind of the idea of sustainability, both passive and active, in terms of landscape, in terms of space for solar panels on the roof, the entire thing. It's actually set up to be net zero, and we're waiting for the green light on this project to get started. But ultimately, a Core 10 clad core with rammed earth that meanders its way through this, kind of mimicking the river that runs through the city. And then these pop-ups that allow natural light to filter in. And of course, the entire thing is mass timber on the inside. So kind of giving it a very warm glow. On the left, there's an image of an exhibition that we had just last year at the Beaverbrook in Fredericton. That was really kind of a chance, I loved seeing the model shop downstairs. It was like, oh, what a beautiful space. Just like the idea of making, we never really lost that. It's like we're still in school in our studio. And so we have models of all of our projects, both kind of end and through the process of kind of exploration. And so we had an opportunity to really kind of share that with the community, which was really exciting. And then on the right, um, again, scratching that itch and starting to experiment fully with this idea of design, right? And so we started to think about the brick light, which is on the top there, and 18 gauge, which we had an opening for both of those just last year. I think there's a double here. And so this was final images used for that product, which is for sale, done with A-Line in Toronto, and also with A-Line, this product called 18 gauge, which are, these things kind of stem from existing projects that we have. Okay, last project. I started with that really, really crummy deck, and I'll end with a much bigger deck. And so Peggy's Cove, as you guys know, is one of Canada's kind of most beloved, cherished landmarks. And just so happens that people really like being in their car when they see it. And so for years, up until, a couple years ago when we took on this project, it's really kind of this ring road where, tourists come in and buses go around and they whip around this thing, and maybe you park and go down and meander on the rocks. But the idea here, and this was all Jordan, working with the Mi'kmaq community, working with kind of the local people of the town, uh, thinking of ways to really kind of reinvent the way that this space is used, both in terms of a real focus on vehicular circulation and parking, but also a real need for the focus of accessibility. It really kind of only catered to one part of society. It was very difficult for people with any kind of mobility issue to really go and explore. And so when thinking about that, we started to kind of carve out these like really broad ideas. And back to the fact that people like being in cars and also don't like change, this became like a massive obstacle in the press. This is literally from the newspaper. And people protesting. There were people with pickets out protesting. And, as much as that was like really terrifying to kind of be hated this much at that time, uh, there was a part of me, I think, that also empathized with the fact that people are afraid of change. And most things that we hold sacred in our cities are often kind of ruined by really thoughtless things. And so this is like a place that really held an important place in people's hearts and minds in Atlantic Canada. And they were worried like some developer was going to come in and just like kind of mow it down and put like a bunch of junk there. And they don't know me, they don't know us. They have no idea what's going on. But we knew that we were kind of focused on something that if it didn't go downhill at some point, like there was a lot of finger crossing, you know, we didn't have the right people on board. Maybe it would have, but we had the right people on board. And I think we also had the benefit of construction happening during COVID, believe it or not. And so people weren't there, which was amazing. Like if there was like the only positive thing that ever came out of that period of time, it was the fact that we could push this project through and people weren't there because they couldn't leave their house. And we were able to build this amazing thing that I get emails about like every week by people who have been on it for the first time in their life, or they haven't been since they were a kid, or have gone back to because it's exciting again. And so this enormous boardwalk that actually juts out and feels almost like you could touch the lighthouse itself is actually really far away from it, but gives people who go visit an amazing kind of experience that I think like wasn't there at all. And so this beautiful thing that is Rick Hansen certified again, that just felt like this takeoff point, where the landscape actually kind of morphs into this thing. And it's becoming more and more beautiful over time because that wood is silvering beautifully. And it's sort of starting to look like the rock. Jordan will be the first to tell you, if he was here, that there were many a night he was in the fetal position in his kitchen reading like these protest things and people just being furious. And so it was actually like, a really tough time for us to kind of push through this, knowing that what we were going to do was going to be special. And so the final thing I want to say, again, about my team, and again, about kind of being and feeling really lucky that design has kind of pointed some faces towards us where we get a little bit of attention. Stephanie and I have been pushing towards really changing the way that we think about women in the profession and starting to look after people. Because if you look at it, there's this hump that happens in the middle, where we start to lose a lot of people and people wonder why, right? It's like, oh, what's happening? Are people not committed? Like, well, it's really expensive, right? Like, and so a few years ago, we started a leave top up policy, partially because of Steph. And we then back paid people who didn't get it before that. And we've basically just been talking about it as much as possible, not just to pressure people into kind of maybe considering it, but because I think the greatest weapon that the people who don't want to pay it have is the fact that nobody talks about it. And so nobody actually even knows if that's normal that their studio doesn't top up their maternity leave during that period. And so I think it's really important that we talk about it. And thank you guys very much.
Hi, Omar. Thanks for the talk. Excuse me.
Oh, hi.
Um, I think your practice is, the trajectory of your practice is really compelling because it reflects a seismic shift in actually architectural practice in Canada generally in terms of how working with and alongside Indigenous peoples has been phenomenal change in a very short period of time. And recognizing that we're an institution, that was named after someone. And recently, National Truth and Reconciliation Day. I'm wondering if you have reflections upon your own education, like during school, if there was any sort of acknowledgement of like working alongside Indigenous peoples, or what you hope, this is a big question, like that kind of incorporation of approaches can be seen in this particular building.
Well, I think a few things that in terms of education, like zero, right? Like, we didn't like how late were we even in education to learn about things, right? I mean, like that came a bit later, but you can't unknow. And it's the most horrific thing. And we were fortunate at Dal to have Richard Croker, who was sort of a leader in engaging with the Indigenous community and really working with and learning from these people. And so in one way, it was about technology, and another way, it was about collaboration and learning outside of kind of the norm of traditional Canadian architectural or just education in Canada. And so there was that for sure. Laurentian. Have you guys been to Laurentian? Like I walked in to do a lecture a few years ago, and in the pit there was a course on drum making that was happening right in the middle of the day. It was one of the courses in the school. Like I think the only way that we actually learn about it is by listening, for one. It's not in a book, but actually having people and paying people properly to be a part of that education, because there was something that happened in between not knowing and the way we are trying to do it now, which is that the wrong people were relaying this message, right? Like you need to hear it from the source. And so I think it's wonderful the shift that architecture, the profession has taken to try and rethink the way that we work. Not everyone's doing that though. Like, I mean, I think that it's there and there are people doing really incredible things. We're working on a birthing center right now, as well as housing for uh, women who are escaping kind of poor home conditions. So kind of two separate projects that we're doing kind of in the community part of our practice right now. And so it's really important. Does that answer that? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. My dad's an architect, and he has done everything in his ability to stop me from being an architect. So I always got to watch him work away until 5 a.m. at night, work alone, work in his office, outside the home, inside the home. Been to construction sites without hard hats. It was a long time ago. Um, so I watched it from outside, but I never got visibility inside his brain. He would never talk about it to me because he knew he was accidentally inspiring me. Um, what I'm curious about is, I just assume architects being artists, the ideas just keep flowing. But like any artist, sometimes the flow stops. So where do you go where do you go physically and or mentally when the ideas are not coming to you? Um, and did your close family members, did your partner or your siblings or parents, have they made any observations that you didn't realize about your own process? And I want to leave it open-ended. You can talk about yourself or somebody else in your firm who might have an interesting process. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess there's a couple parts of that. One surprising thing might be that we work 9 to 5 in our office. We don't work overtime. Like, there are times and people who just can't help themselves. Jordan, like is there all the time. But like we just don't have that culture. And I think the way that you have a culture like that is a very clear process and a way of making decisions so that you don't kind of use all the time that you have, right? Like people used to work all night, but like they probably would have worked all night even longer if there was more time in the day, right? Like, so I think we've done pretty well considering we just have regular hours and a really kind of healthy, as you can tell, I wrote down a list of things that I hated about the profession. And then I created a practice that just did all of the opposite things. And I think it's worked out pretty good. So those were all just imaginary things that people did because someone was bullying them into doing it. In terms of family, like, yeah, my dad, he was interested in art. He went down kind of a science path. He I think very early in his age was very passionate about art and just was drawn to it. But like I think when he saw that I might have like a spark of talent, he got so excited that he could like kind of live this through me a little bit, that like then I went to like art class, and then I applied to go to Mayfield, and then like he took me to I remember he took me to an exhibition that had like Degas and Picasso at University College at University of Toronto, like in the early 90s or late 80s or something. And so like he was just like, what about this? Like, what about if you, and there's not a single person not, or not a single person anywhere even a mile close to the arts in my family since like now till, you know, as far back as you could go. And so it was like, yeah, my parents were just like really excited for me to go down that road. So in that case, maybe it's a little bit different, but we're looking out for, my son happens to be excited about architecture right now. He's 12. I think he just sees that I have like a lot of fun and that we have a lot of fun in the studio. And so like, of course he's drawn to that. Um, and it's not that I'm not encouraging him. It's more just like, I want him to kind of come to that conclusion on his own. What was the other part of your question? Oh, right. Yeah. Well, you know what? I actually am pretty serious about that because I feel like there's a limited number of ideas in there, like limited, like it's not a endless thing. And so it really irritates me to waste it on the wrong people or projects. And so I'm very careful about the projects we actually take on because that thing is going to run out. The other part to that is that I don't really need to worry about that because I'm surrounded by people who are more talented than I am. And we're all just talking all the time. And so the inspiration is all the stuff that we're excited about as a group. Like it's not that traditional practice where they're waiting for the boss to like send a sketch down. It's just not like that. Sometimes it is like that. Sometimes Jeff, sometimes John Gray or Steph or whatever. But like we're just jamming all the time.
Hey, it's me again.
I
I'm seeing like a reoccurring like motive in your presentation. Maybe it's just me, but I'm seeing a lot of like model making, a lot of like hand-eye coordination, a lot of just trial and error. That old school stuff you said, the Rick Hansen accessibility thing, giving back, making sure people have access, especially nowadays. The skylights that you implement a lot, coming from that moon analogy in your Dalhousie project, maybe. I'm seeing some sort of like a spiritual kind of vibe going on, and I'm trying to see can you talk a little bit about that and where do you see yourself taking your practice and standing out even more? What are some other like symbolisms that you're working on currently in the future?
Yeah, I don't know. Uh, that was a doozy. I would just say that we're having a lot of fun. We, as you can tell, and we're not just drawn to projects with bigger, budgets or things like that. Like we just want to work on. I see like awards and all that stuff as just opening up opportunities. That's the only thing it kind of means to me. Is basically like a larger pool of places and people that we can do really exciting things with. And that's it. I just want to kind of ride through this career doing things that have an impact on people. People love it. It makes us happy to kind of go through this process. And we're making a positive change, like to kind of do all those simple things. And then about like light and all that. Yeah, I think it's just about slowing time down. I think if you can um, encourage people in these crazy busy lives to kind of just take a breath and like pay attention to something, um that's a pretty powerful move, right? Even if it's in an accessible toilet. Oh, there's one over there.
You, while you're speaking, you spoke about how halfway through you were thinking maybe you're just very lucky. I wanted to ask, do you still think like after all of this, do you think this is just a really good long stroke of luck?
That's a good question. Uh, yeah, I definitely don't take any of it for granted. I'll tell you that. I do worry about waking up and this not having happened. I'm riding this as hard as I can. Um, and all I can say about that is that every opportunity that came as a result of this thing, we went like 1,000 times over the top in terms of effort to do it well. So that I don't have to look back and kind of like kick myself for ruining this like streak of luck. So part of that is just anxiety and fear. Part of it is just like, oh man, this is very, very fortunate that we get to do this. Yeah. We're done?
Well, Omar, thank you so much for being here. Having spent actually much of my early life practicing life in Nova Scotia, I know what a profound impact on the practice of architecture in Atlantic Canada. So thank you so much. And on behalf of the school, thank you for being here for our first lecture of the year. And just an announcement, we'll be having Alison Brooks from London, England, coming to lecture on October 31st. So please join us.